All right, so what we need to do next is to set up our repository, which will allow us to then tap into our book API. Okay, so let's go back to our code here. So in our repository, I'm going to create a new class. Let's call this book repository. Such. It's going to just be a normal class like anything else, except we are going to inject here our constructor with, yes, our private API. I should say private val API, which is going to be our books API such, because we need access to our books API in order to get the data, right? Our repository will have functions that will access our API books API here, remember, to get, for instance, get all books or get info books. So we're going to create a suspend function here because remember, we want to make sure that all of these transactions are done correctly inside of a coroutine so that it can force everything to run in the back thread. So suspend fun here, I'm going to say get books. And of course, I'm going to pass a search query, which is going to be just a string. And now here I'm going to receive a list. Okay, this list will contain items. Now make sure that we get our item from our model. So this is the item. If we go ahead and click on that, it is this item here which says access info, tag, and so forth. Get the volume info. So essentially what we're doing is we are getting each one of these objects inside of this items list or array, right? So we're modeling after this data here. So then we can go and get kind, ID, tag, or volume info, which is an object within itself, and get title, authors, and so forth. This will have to, of course, be a function and returns a list. So it's going to expect to return a list. Now, the way things are right now, it would work fine because we're expecting a list of items, and that's fine. However, it would be nice to be able to wrap this list inside of another object or another class per se, so that we can attach more information to it, right? So we can, for instance, attach whether the transaction was successful of getting this data, whether there are exceptions, and so forth. Okay, so to simplify our lives, I'm going to create yet another class here inside of our data. It's going to be a sealed class, and let's call this resource. Okay, we can name anything, but resource works just fine. So what is this resource? Well, this resource is going to be expecting a type T template, which means it's going to be a generic, so we can pass any type we want. And then here in its constructor, I'm going to pass val data, which is going to receive that type T, which also, by the way, we can just say can be null. And we're going to pass val message, any kind of message we want. It could be a string type, okay, in this case, which can also be null as such. And then inside of this class, then I'm going to create other classes that will inherit our resource. So in this case, I'm going to say success, for instance. It's going to pass any type T, right? And then the data is going to be of the type T that we are accepting in our success class there. And this will inherit resource T, and we're going to pass the data. I'm going to create yet another class here called error. So if there's some issues, exceptions, and so forth, we can actually pass all like that. I'm going to say message, it's going to be a string. And I can pass data, in this case, data T, which can also be null as such. Okay, and I'm going to pass resource T and pass data and message. And I can also create another class here that will handle the loading state. So pass T and the data of this type, going to be just any type really. And of course it can be null, set it to null. And it's also going to inherit from our resource T, and we pass along that data. Okay, so what we're doing here is that now we can have a structure that we can use, such a resource type. We can pass the type, let's say list of item like we have, And then we're going to be able then to say, well, in this class here, we can pass the data. In this case here, we can then attach information to our list because it's going to be wrapped inside of a resource. So we can pass data, which will, in this case, can be the objects that we're getting from our API, right? Or can be null, nothing, and we can pass a message along and so forth, right? And we can also attach the success, error, and loading. So this is a very important way of structuring your objects or wrapping your objects that may require a little bit more data so that we have more information about the status of the data per se. So what we're going to do next here is that instead of passing in a list of items as such, just like that, we're actually going to wrap inside of a resource. And the type is going to be list of items, like that. So now we can say try, put this inside of a try. We can say val item list, for instance. It's going to be a list of type E, whatever we want. In this case, I'm going to say API dot get all books and pass our search query, like that. And then I'm going to say dot items. So what I'm saying now, because this item list here, we're actually getting all the books from our data. We're actually getting all the books from our API, and we are not just getting all the books as such, but we have to go and say dot items, because you can see the items, meaning this endpoint here is a list. So we're getting the list of all of books. Okay, and now it's going to be inside of our item list. Well, when that happens, because I know this resource object here, right, it has many other, we can pass out, because I know a resource we can. So once that happens, I'm going to use resource again, our good friend, right? And I can say the success class, I'm going to pass, in this case, some data along. I'm going to say data is going to be what? Item. So now this item list is going to be wrapped inside of our resource, that's success. And while I'm here, I can go ahead when this is about to happen, right? This try is about to be ran. I can say resource, look at this, dot loading. The data in this case is going to be something like loading. And then we're going to pass catch here. It's an exception. And then I'm going to say resource. So in this case here, so if this happens, we have an exception. We can then load up our resource, again, class that we created. And I'm going to say dot error. And then I'm going to pass a message that says, well, I'm going to just pass the exception that we're receiving, that message, and toString like this. And because we need to return a resource type, all we can do really is just say return in the beginning there. So it will go ahead and try and return what needs to be returned depending on the status of our data fetching. Okay, so while we're here, let's go ahead and create the next one. It's going to be suspend fun. This is going to be get book info, which we will look at later, but nevertheless, we're here. Let's go ahead and deal with it. So book ID, that's what we need to pass, and it's going to be a string type. I'm going to do the same thing. This guy now needs a resource of type item. That's what we're receiving. We just want one book, really, or book object. Okay, item in this case. So we do the same thing. Say val response, and I'm going to just add that to try as such. And I'm going to say, in fact, for this data here, because it can be any type, I can just pass a boolean. This is the beauty. I can just say true because it is updating, right? And this is the beauty, again, if we go back to our resource, that's the beauty of having a template, of having generics, because we can pass any type we want. That's why we have this T as a template. All right, there we go. So back to our get info here. Well, get book info, that is. I'm going to start by saying resource that loading again. And for our data, I'm going to say it's going to be true, that we indeed loading. Okay. And then I'm going to say API that get book info like that and pass our book ID because that's what's needed. Okay. And then I'm going to say catch again, exception, Kotlin, Java, doesn't matter really. And then here I'm just going to say in return a resource dot error, and I'm going to pass the message, say an error occurred, and if I want I can pass the exception. And then at the end here at the bottom I'm going to still say resource again, that loading I'm going to set it to false, right? So data now is false because everything, the loading should be over with. And then let's go ahead and return our resource success, which then I'm going to pass for our data, I'm going to pass the response that we just received there. All right, good. So what we can do here, I can just check to say if, real quick, item list that is not empty, then I can say resource dot loading and pass data to false. Okay, so what I'm doing here is that in the beginning a resource is loading, so it's true, and then once we hopefully have something in our get all books, then we are just gonna check if items is not empty. If that's the case, we're gonna check set the loading to false. All right, okay, that should do it. Next we are going to see how can we use this book repository and see if we can start getting some data from our API.